All right, good morning and welcome to the Accessibility and Disability Policy webinar series. My name is Randy Turner and I'm with the Governor's Committee on People with Disabilities, and I'm the Accessibility and Disability Rights Coordinator. Today's session is Top Tips for Tip-Top Transition with Elizabeth Danner from the Educational Service Center, Region 13. Welcome, Elizabeth. Go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy. Hopefully my microphone is working. So welcome. Thanks for coming today or viewing the recorded webinar. And my goal for this next bit of time that we're going to spend together is to talk a little about a lot of things with transition planning. So you might be a parent who's heading toward some serious transition planning. Your child is getting to that age where it's going to be included in the ARD committee discussion. And so you're trying to get ready and you want to know what to expect. You might also be a parent who is currently in the, maybe your child is in high school, or you're a student in high school and you've been doing transition planning, but you just want to know a little bit more about it and get some of the lingo and some of the requirements, get a little more information about it. So that's what we're going to cover. Before we do that, there we go. I just want to quickly review who I am. I am with Region 13 Education Service Center, and if you're not familiar with the service centers, Texas is divided into 20 education service centers, and what we provide is training and assistance for schools and families and others to understand the legal requirements for schools and best practices. And so I am in Austin, Region 13 is in Austin, and in my role with the statewide network for transition, my whole purpose is to consider post-school outcomes for students with disabilities. And that's for students along the full continuum of ability and disability. And so what that really entails is thinking about connecting every student with career or a contribution to their community and making real connections for students. And of course that is a process, so we're going to talk about that process today. I did share with Randy some resources. These are, you can think of them as handouts. They're not required in order to participate in the webinar. I just want to start today with helping you know that there are further resources and there are some specific resources available. And we'll be also reviewing some other resources as well. But those are available. And so now let's get into our top tips. First top tip is pretty broad. Think big, dream bigger. So really what we're thinking here is my recommendation for educators and families and students with disabilities is don't limit yourself to, when you're thinking long-term planning, don't limit yourself to what's available currently. Don't limit yourself to the struggles and the challenges. Think about yourself or your child on their best day. And think about what you want that to look like in adulthood. What do you want a good day to look like in adulthood? Start there. Later you can fill in with the supports and the services that will be needed to make that happen. But you really want to start with, what does a good day look like? Does it involve work? Does it involve paid work? Does it involve college? Does it involve training? Just kind of thinking, you know, what does a good day look like? Is it out of the house all day? Is it living at home? Is it living in a supported living environment? Is it living independently? What does that look like? Does it include marriage? Does it include, you know, what does a good day look like? What does adulthood look like? And then later fill in the supports that would be necessary. But I always like to start here because what I have noticed is that sometimes families or students with disabilities can kind of get bogged down with the challenges, and sometimes it can be hard to see the dream. So, you know, I like to encourage students and families to think about your best day and what does a good day look like in the future. And with educators, what sometimes educators struggle with is, you know, all of this has to be recorded in the IEP, which is a legal document, the Individual Education Plan. And so sometimes that can be very anxiety-inducing, is that when we start recording dreams and writing goals for adulthood into an IEP, educators can sometimes be concerned, oh, am I going to be legally responsible for making this happen? I can't control the job opportunities in the community. I can't control whether a student seeks support at college, and how can I manage this and put this in the IEP? So I like to help educators understand we're writing the description and we're filling in with what supports we anticipate a student might need to make that happen in the future. But this is kind of an encouragement tip, is to think big, dream bigger, and then we'll fill in the blanks later. Next tip is really down to brass tacks. The Texas Transition and Employment Guide. This came out of some legislation a few years ago where TEA, the Texas Education Agency, was required to produce a Texas Transition and Employment Guide because the frustration with families across the state were that they didn't have a sense of transition services can look different from district to district and campus to campus. And so either it was, what's required for everyone. There was some question about that. And also there was a question about what resources do we need? What should we be doing now? What does this involve? So the sections in the Texas Transition and Employment Guide, or what I usually just refer to as the guide, include things like self-advocacy, self-determination, transition services, just basics. What does it involve? And employment, supported employment, social security programs, community and long-term services and supports, post-secondary educational programs and services, information sharing with agencies, what that looks like, and guardianship and alternatives, which really we've kind of flipped the script on that, and we really start with alternatives and then move to guardianship. We'll talk about that later. It also includes contact information for the agencies. So this is a great way to connect with. We talked about how to have a good life in adulthood, adults with disabilities need some supports. So finding those supports now and connecting with those supports, that's a good way to do that. And it also includes timelines for steps that you can take now. So this is a great resource. And you can see that it's available there at transitionintexas.org/guide. Then the next tip is the TED. There may be more than one person named Ted in the district where your child attends school, but there's only one TED. And this also came out of some legislation a few years ago where each district is required to assign a designee for transition and employment services. So the shorthand version of that is the TED. And if you're familiar with Legal Framework website, which is out of Region 18, that has a lot of great resources for the special education processes in Texas and the federal rules as well. And what it also gives us is the list of TEDs for every district and charter school in the state. So if you want to know more about transition planning in your district, you would want to start maybe by talking with the TED. And so you can find the TED. What you see here is a screenshot of the legal framework where the TED list is located. When you land at Legal Framework, there's one click. You would want to find where it says Transition and Employment Services Designee. Click that, it takes you here. And you can see that I pulled up, for this screenshot I pulled up the search A to Z list, and I just clicked the first district listed, and you can see that that little pop-up gave me, when I clicked on the little icon of the person, it pulled up the TED for that district and their contact information. The other thing it will give you is if you click on the website icon, it will take you to the district website where the Texas Transition and Employment Guide is posted. So a lot of great information here. You can also search for your district or charter school in the search. So just, it's a good person to keep in mind, partly because this, the Texas Education Code 29.011 includes a lot of information about transition planning. And this is the piece that it shows about the TED and what they're supposed to do. So it tells you that each school district is required to designate at least one employee. And that individual is supposed to know about transition planning and services and be able to connect you with the right resources. And also that person is designed to support the interagency collaboration, that they're supposed to be able to help you connect with agencies, and the law lists some of the agencies, the statewide agencies: Health and Human Services, Texas Workforce. Some of you may know that as vocational rehab or VR, formerly DARS. So you might know that under different names, but they list some of the agencies. But of course, we know that there are many, many agencies, and depending on the area where you live, there might be a lot of helpful resources for you and your child in adulthood. And so that person is really designed to connect you with those agencies. One caution I provide to educators or TEDs is I tell TEDs, be sure that you're not sharing eligibility or other requirements for agencies. That really the role of the TED is to connect families and students with those agencies, and to be sure that there's sharing of information and maybe inviting those agencies in. But what I really caution TEDs and what I share with parents is that the TED is not supposed to know everything about the requirements for eligibility for each agency. They want to know about the agency. They want to know, they hopefully would be able to help you ask the right questions for your situation when you visit with that agency. So a TED might be able to help you think through what questions to ask and how to talk with that agency. But a TED is not supposed to know everything about the requirements for each agency. They really are school staff, and they speak to school requirements and ARD committee requirements. So that's just kind of a caution about, and I share that with TEDs because as soon as, if I'm a TED and I'm meeting with a parent and an agency, and that agency tells that parent, well, you're not going to be eligible for services because your income is too high. Let's say that happens in that meeting. What I wouldn't want to do is go back to work with another parent and say, well, your income is going to be too high, because I am not the keeper of those rules. So I may have heard that in one meeting, but I don't know all the information behind that decision. So what I want to do is tell that next parent, you want to be sure to ask them about income and if that's going to affect your child's eligibility for services, things like that. That's really the design of the TED. But there you see the rules under Texas Education Code 29.011. And so while we're speaking lingo and jargon, let's talk about that in tip number 4. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at the technical term, and then we're just going to talk about what it really means. So with that, you see the list of the terms that you might see in the IEP. I want to highlight for you a couple of terms. We see the word goals twice. And so I want to highlight for you that those are very different goals, and it can be very confusing for ARD committees. So we'll talk about that. But first, let's talk about student involvement in the ARD. So student involvement is required, and student invitation, every student where transition will be discussed, at any ARD where transition will be discussed, a student must be invited to their ARD. They must know that it's happening. And ideally, that student will attend the ARD, so this is by age 14 or earlier if appropriate. And ideally, students will attend their ARD, and I like to think of this on a continuum, that we're going to invite every student, make sure that they know that an ARD is coming, and then we are going to, as an ARD committee outside of the ARD, we're going to think about what does the student's involvement look like for this ARD. So for a 13-year-old, this is the first time that they're talking about transition. Some 13-year-olds are going to be able to lead their own ARD meeting. It's happened. It happens every day in schools. Some schools do a great job with supporting students in leading their ARD meeting before age 14. For other students, or maybe for this student this year at this ARD, they're having a lot of struggles in school, and leading their ARD meeting is just too much to ask right now this year. So we might dial that back, and they're going to attend, maybe introduce the members, and then they can be excused whenever they are ready to be excused. Or maybe they're going to contribute information outside of the ARD, and then we're going to support them in understanding what we talked about at the ARD meeting. So you can think of this along the continuum. There's not one way to do this, but it is important that ARD committees are thinking about student involvement and what it looks like for this student at this ARD. And transition assessments is such a critical piece of the transition planning process. This is where it all starts, and this is always where I go back. Whenever we get stuck in transition planning, where we have too many questions and not enough answers, we go back and look at, do we need another transition assessment? Because really all these are structured conversations that are led by educators in order to discover information. When we see that word assessment, a lot of times special educators think of diagnosticians, and they think about those assessments and evaluations for eligibility. So those are pretty structured, formal assessments that require licensure. That's not necessarily what these are. Other people look at assessments and they think in terms of state assessment, the STAR assessment. That's not these either. So transition assessments can come in the flavors of formal or informal. Formal are normed and valid and reliable and standardized. And then informal transition assessments are just, casual conversations, or maybe they're person-centered planning. They might be structured, but they are informal assessments. So again, there's no requirement in terms of how many or what type must be completed for each ARD where transition will be discussed. What is required is that transition assessments be completed. And certainly what we encourage is look at what you know about the student. What we tell educators in ARD committees is look at what do we know about the student and what do we need to know in order to plan effectively. That's where we're going to decide which transition assessments are going to be most helpful for this conversation. So that's what we mean by transition assessments. And here we go into goals. Post-secondary goals are really more descriptions of where the student will work and learn and live after high school. So we're just describing when the bus stops coming and special education and public education is no longer available, the day after that exit from public school, what does life look like? So we're thinking kind of short term, right after high school, what does life look like? And we're just describing what that looks like. Upon graduation from high school, Elizabeth will be enrolled in college to pursue a degree in special education. Upon graduation from college, Elizabeth will be employed as a special education teacher. Something like that, that we're really describing what life looks like. Whereas with our annual goals, those are really the skills. So you see the key terms there is a post-secondary goal is a description that it's something we can measure. We can go and see a year after Elizabeth exits public school, we can see, is she enrolled in college? Is she pursuing a degree in education? But the annual goals are going to be the skills that the student works on this year that they'll need in adulthood to meet those post-secondary goals. And these are the goals that we are most familiar with in special education. Annual goals are something that we've been using and we've been seeing in IEPs as soon as our child first became eligible for special education services. So it can be confusing to see that word goals and to think, well, shouldn't that look like those other goals? And it should not. So next we're going to think about something called the coordinated set of activities. In some IEP programs, this is called transition services section. It can be called different things. And it's all just a fancy way of describing a to-do list. So this is just, what do we need to do now? We know that the school is going to be teaching skills that the student will need in adulthood after describing what life looks like in adulthood. Well, what about these other things that we need to do? If Elizabeth is going to go to college and she has a learning disability in math calculation, and we know that to earn a degree in education, there's going to be at least one math course required. So what would I need to do now? I would need to contact the Office for Students with Disabilities at the colleges of my choice. I might need to connect with agencies that can support. I might need to do some different things to consider, to be able to put things in place for later down the road. So these are really a to-do list. Maybe another thing that might be important is that I learn to request accommodations from my teachers now while I'm in high school. So if that's something that that is going to be necessary down the road, I might need to practice that. It's not really a skill, it's just a thing I need to be doing. It's not a skill based on my disability, so that would be an IEP goal. It's just an activity, it's something I need to do. And so maybe we list that. And maybe I get support now from my teachers in high school, and later when I go off to college, I'll be expected to do that on my own. So, so that's the way to think about the coordinated set of activities. It's a to-do list, and it really is going to help us identify what needs to be done, who needs to do it, and by when. This is a great section for parents And when I was a case manager at high school, I used this section to really help parents understand the activities that they could be doing outside of school to support their young adult. So this can be a really helpful section. And then we also have something called the course of study, and this is just the 4-year plan, thinking about what classes are going to support each student's post-secondary goals. In Texas, we have something called a personal graduation plan, or PGP, and that's required for all students. And that really meets the requirements for course of study. So I encourage schools to use the personal graduation plan, or PGP, put that into the IEP and use that as your course of study so that we're not duplicating work. And we don't have a counselor somewhere on campus developing a PGP while the art committee develops a course of study. Let's use one document. That's something I encourage. Districts do that different ways, campuses do that different ways, but the main thing is that as a parent or as a student, you have a sense of what classes do I have to take in order to get the diploma that I am, and through the graduation program that I'm pursuing, and what are the options here at my school? If I'm interested in this field, what are the options? What kinds of electives can I take that are available at this high school that will help me? And so that leads me to agency linkage. So when we think about that, we talked about how the Texas Transition and Employment Guide gives you timelines and list of contact information for agencies. So this, again, we're going to be thinking about what agencies will be needed in adulthood. So I like to think about, there are some students who are eligible for speech therapy during school. So they receive speech therapy services. But some students are going to need continued speech therapy into adulthood, maybe to support use of an augmentative communication device or for other reasons. And then some students are going to access speech therapy services during school when they're eligible for FAPE, but beyond that, their speech impairment will be where it is. And so they will just have learned the strategies to work around, but they're not planning to pursue speech therapy services continued into adulthood. And so that's, two different ways to think about that speech therapy. So if it's a student who's going to need speech therapy continued, they're going to need someone to help program their augmentative communication device and teach them how to use that and adapt it and send it off to be fixed. If that's going to be something that they need support to do in adulthood, then we want to connect them now with the people who'll be able to do that. And so we want to think about that and include that in the IEP. And sometimes we want to invite that agency to an ARD meeting where we're talking about transition. And so that's something that schools are required to be thinking about. So if the school asks you as a parent for consent to invite an agency, you want to think about that. And if you have questions, talk to the school about why are you wanting to invite this agency at this time. Of course, a parent can invite anyone to any ARD, so a parent is able to invite an agency at any point, but the school is also required to consider agency linkage and to think about what makes sense for this student for this ARD meeting. And then there's a term called summary of performance, and this is one of the greatest things, one of the best resources, because as a student or parent who has received special ed services, you leave school with a stack of folders and IEPs and documentation and a lot of information about your child's disability and its impact on academics and other areas. The summary of performance is designed to really condense that and to help you get a description of the disability and the impact and what supports worked in high school in order to be successful, and the school's recommendations for meeting post-secondary goals. So it might be recommendations to connect with Office for Students with Disabilities at college, which many students with disabilities don't. They leave high school, they say special ed was something I did in high school, I'm not going to do that at college. And a lot of students with disabilities end up failing out because of that, because by the time they request services, it's too late. So it's really important that students leave high school with a plan for what kind of services and supports and accommodations do I need to request and who can help me do that. And so the summary of performance can be a really helpful condensed version of all of that information. And this is something that is shared when a student graduates and exits school. So at that, we're going to talk about transfer of rights at age of majority, because at age 18, all legal rights and responsibilities transfer to the individual, regardless of that individual's disability status or impact of disability. All legal rights officially transfer, and we'll talk about that in a later tip. So with that, I'm going to move us into, that's an important reason that we talk about self-determination. And so with this next tip, we're going to look at what PACER Center, which is a resource for parents that I have a link to later in the slides. PACER Center talks about self-determination as a process that begins in childhood and continues throughout one's life. So we have all learned to be self-determined adults, those of us who are over 18. And it's, of course, important for all people, but it's especially important for young people with disabilities. And the challenge can be that well-meaning individuals sometimes protect children with disabilities by making all their decisions for them. Or sometimes people assume that people with disabilities can't think for themselves. And so there could be this overprotective impulse from people in the person with a disability's life. And so PACER Center really articulates the importance of learning self-determination. And in Texas, the Texas Education Code that we looked at earlier, 29.011, also includes the requirement for ARD committees to consider and, if appropriate, address in the IEP the use and availability of appropriate supplementary aids, services, curricula, and other opportunities to assist the student in developing decision-making skills. That is one of the core components of self-determination, is decision-making skills. And supports and services to foster the student's independence and self-determination, including a supported decision-making agreement. We'll talk about what that is in a couple of slides. But just notice that Texas has really elevated self-determination as a priority for transition planning. And the way I like to think about this is we can think about this broadly. Every student in Texas, if you look at the vision, mission, and goals for any district or any charter school in Texas, you're going to see statements like, this district will produce citizens who are independent and able to contribute to society. Something like that. Every school district has those. So every district for all students is thinking about self-determination. And so we see things like campus-wide strategies. That might be things like social emotional learning, PBIS, positive behavior interventions and supports. So we might see campus-wide strategies, and we might also see classroom opportunities. There's something called CHAMPS that right now I cannot remember the acronym for that, but it's a classroom behavior support strategy, and it's something that a lot of classrooms use, where we have clearly posted behavioral expectations, and so there might be classroom opportunities for decision-making, for choice-making, for things like that, for increasing independence. And then, of course, we are going to narrow down to individual supports and think about fading those supports. So this is going to look a lot of different ways, and I always, as usual, I like to start with thinking every student is a general education student, and so thinking about a lot of students with disabilities are going to be able to access the naturally occurring strategies and opportunities that are available for all students, and they may not need any further specialized support. And then some students are going to need some specialized support to learn these skills and to increase independence as much as they are able. So we're just going to look at that student by student. But it speaks well of Texas that that's really a priority, that self-determination is a priority. So with that, let's talk about the transfer of rights at age 18. And so this is something I mentioned earlier, that the ARD committee, the legal rights, regardless of the individual's disability or its impact on communication or on decision-making, that the legal rights transfer at the age of 18. And so what that looks like for a student who is still in school is that parents switch from receiving an invitation to the ARD and a phone call from the school asking when is the best time for you to be able to come to the ARD, that switches. And it becomes a notice of the ARD. You will be made aware, if you're a parent of an 18-year-old or older, you'll be made aware that an ARD will be held, but you will not be invited unless the student invites you. So that's a big shift. And that also looks different in terms of medical and financial and other legal decisions. Those belong to the individual who's 18 or older. And I am much older than 18. I still refer to my parents for advice on legal, medical, and financial decisions. I call them, but the decision is mine. And the consequences, therefore, are mine as well. And so that's just an important thing for parents to be thinking about. And also it can impact for, when we think about our 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds who are in colleges, the communication as parents in public schools, you're very used to getting 6-week progress reports and getting the art information and IEPs and all of that information sent to you. If you call a college and say, how's my child doing in their classes, they're going to tell you that you need to ask your young adults. And so that communication shifts very significantly as well. So when we think about that, depending on the needs, we can think about the options for all adults that in terms of least invasive to the most support. If we look top down, most adults are at full independence, and that's true for most adults with disabilities. They have full independence. And I'm thinking that, Randy, a question maybe came up?
Well, Elizabeth, something that I think maybe is clarification. I know you were going to take most of the questions at the end, but
Sure.
James asked, so the laws say that only the student over 18 can invite the parent and the school is unable to invite the parents. Is that correct?
So yes, so what the law says is that what shifts at age 18 is that the student receives an invitation and the parent receives notice of the ARD. So most parents, there are pieces of the law that do talk about, and that law that we looked at before, 29.011, and other places in the code do require that schools consider parent involvement over 18 and parent involvement prior to 18. But it does list it specifically that we do need to shift our thinking and look at appropriate parent involvement. So it does, and there's also a year before turning 18, schools are required to send notice of the transfer of rights with those legal requirements. And I meant to mention that one of the resources that I referenced at the beginning and that I shared the link is the TEA model form for the transfer of rights. So if you are even much younger, if your child is much younger than 18 and you're interested in learning more about that, the TEA model form has information about the transfer of rights, and they also include links to resources and agencies, and just there's a lot of information. It's a big packet of pages. So the TEA model form is something I would recommend if you want to know more about the transfer of rights. But it is an important shift. So it's not the parents are not involved, but involvement changes, even legally within thinking about invitation versus notice of ARD. So it is important that we think about that. And again, that TEA model form will include more information. So as you think about that, and again, thinking about your child on their best day, and then thinking about the challenges on the not best day. So thinking about what are some of the challenges and the impact of their disability on decision making. So thinking in terms of the least support to the most support, that we start with thinking about full independence. And then there's something called the Supported Decision-Making Agreement, which Texas, we can be proud to say, was the first state in the country to have a legal supported decision-making agreement as part of the Estates Code. And so what that is that's something that anyone can sign. So if I decided that I wanted support to make medical decisions, and I wanted Randy to be my supporter, I could sign, and we could either have it notarized or we could have witnesses sign it, and we would sign it, and I would indicate on there that Randy is my supporter for medical decisions. And what that does is it just gives her a little more room. Like, let's say I have a doctor's appointment and I want her to come with me. That doctor might also require that I sign a consent to release. They can do that as well. But that just gives a little more support for her to have some access to my medical information than if I were at full independence. And, but ultimately the decision is mine. So if my doctor recommends a treatment and Randy thinks that probably would be the best one for you, Elizabeth, and she talks to me and says, you really probably want to listen to your doctor on this one, I still get to make the determination whether I pursue that treatment, even with that signed supportive decision-making agreement. So I retain the rights to make decisions. But it's a tool to help me make decisions. And then we have power of attorney where you're delegating authority to make decisions. And then we go to the most restrictive, which is the guardianship. And so a sign of kind of progress is that when I first started teaching, we flipped this and we started talking about guardianship for our students with intellectual disabilities. We started the conversation with families at guardianship. We're switching that now. In schools, we start with full independence and then we move. And what each family is going to do, oh, I need to mention networks first. Networks of support are going to be great support for anyone at any level of support need. And so always consider networks and parent-to-parent, pathways to adulthood. They have some really great resources on forming networks. But what each family is going to do is they're going to consider what supports for decision-making will our child need and what works for our family. So there's no right or wrong answer along this continuum. You're just going to be considering what works for our family and what do we need to be thinking about for decision-making. So with that, when we look at other legal changes, again, I like to highlight IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, that is the Special Education in Public Schools law. That's an entitlement law. And you may have heard terms such as child find. The ARD meeting, the IEP document, all of those come from IDEA. And that ensures provision of FAPE, free and appropriate public education. And so that is a different way to think about the ADA, what disability looks like under ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And there we're looking at eligibility. And interestingly, the actual definition of disability changes from IDEA to ADA, the definition. If you think you know what it means to have a disability, legally, it looks different under each of those rules. And so ADA is more about protecting people with disabilities from discrimination as opposed to providing FAPE, free and appropriate public education. So that's an important piece. And so with under ADA, and that's going to be what is used at colleges and employers, and that's the way we're going to think about disability supports outside of public education. And so those supports can look different. The types of accommodations offered might look different at college than at high school. There's also the term undue burden under ADA, that an employer or a business can't have undue burden. And so just there's a lot of shifts. So it's important that you be thinking about what that looks like as well in terms of the supports that you receive under IDEA and what is available under ADA. So let's take a moment to think about graduation. So we've talked about transition planning in the IEP, and now we're looking at planning for graduation. And a good news piece is that in Texas, all students are eligible to receive a diploma, and that's the same diploma as there's no difference in diploma. What is different is the high school program that a student pursues. So what we're gonna look at is information. I tried to distill down how to think about graduation for anyone. So if you're a parent of a child who is 5 years old and just going into graduation or going into kindergarten, what I'm about to share will apply to your child when they get to high school, even though the legislature will meet many times before then and the graduation requirements will change probably many times. The way to think about graduation will not change. This also will apply if you have a student who's currently a junior or senior in high school and all you're thinking about is graduation. So this will be just kind of a quick breakdown. And one of the tools that I referenced at the beginning is the graduation toolkit from TEA. And again, I think I forgot to mention that each of the tools that I mentioned at the beginning are available in English and in Spanish, and they are accessible. So, so you have a graduation toolkit that's really looking at graduation as it currently exists for all students currently in high school. So Here's the way to think about graduation for a student with a disability. You're going to be thinking about curriculum and assessment, as all students do, and then you're going to be thinking about the disability impact and the adaptations that are needed to access curriculum and assessment. And also you're going to be thinking about the end of eligibility. How long are we eligible to receive FAPE? So to think about that, with curriculum, we're going to be thinking about there are going to be classes and credits required for all students forever. When I was in high school, it looked a little bit different, but I took English classes, I took algebra, I took geometry. There are some basics that we can expect to be for any student, that there's always going to be required courses, and there are going to be electives, and that is going to change campus to campus. So if you're in a rural school district, you might see more CTE classes that are focused on ag kinds of courses, agriculture. If you're in a school district that's near a large hospital, you might see some health sciences electives. It's just going to depend on the opportunities at that campus and the needs in the community. So that's going to change. The types of electives are going to change campus to campus. But you're going to always be asking what classes are required for my cohort, and a cohort is the year of entering 9th grade. So the students who entered this year are in the 2018-19 cohort. And so what requirements, what's required for students in that cohort, and then as they move through high school. And when we think about classes, we're always going to be thinking about least restrictive environment. And we think about that every kid, every class. So we don't think about least restrictive environment in terms of type of disability. We think of that in terms of every kid in every class. What is the least restrictive environment for this student in this class this year? So that's just going to be one of the considerations that we have. And then for assessments, right now we have STAR and we have EOCs, or end of course exams. And that's been in place for several years. And so we have currently 5 end of course exams required. You may have heard of the Individual Graduation Committee, or IGC. There's more information about that on the TEA website. But regardless, at any point that you're thinking about graduation, you want to know, what are the assessment requirements? What assessments must a student pass? And if it's a student with a disability, the ARD committee can determine that passing is not required for graduation. And so any student with a disability, even if their disability impacts so significantly that they need alternate assessment or that they're not able to pass any of the required assessments, the ARD committee can determine that passing is not required. So that kind of leads us into the disabilities impact. So we're going to think in terms of accommodations or modifications, or that term alternate achievement standards. Those are really significant modifications. Notice that modifications and alternate achievement standards are listed in red. Once we move away from accommodations, which change how information is presented or how a student shows mastery of the curriculum, once we see that shift into modifications, which changes what a student is required to master, or alternate achievement standards, which keeps us with the same grade level content but at a different expectation level, once we make that shift, then opportunities might change. So we want to be very careful, and what you want to be doing with your ARD committee is, when you're talking about the classes your student is taking and the assessments that they're taking, you want to know, do they receive accommodations or modifications, or are they on alternate achievement standards? What does that look like? How significant is the impact of their disability, and how significant are the adaptations that we're making this year? And what does that mean for their graduation? So then when we talk about the end of eligibility, in terms of eligibility, so all students need to meet curriculum and assessment requirements in order to graduate in Texas and earn a diploma. ARD committees get to make some adaptations for students with disabilities in order to earn that diploma. Many students with disabilities, when they meet credit and assessment requirements, they are no longer eligible for FAPE. If they have accommodations only to meet their graduation requirements, then at the end of that, hopefully 4th year, when they have met credit and assessment requirements, they're no longer eligible for FAPE. That has ended. And so that's an important thing to be aware of, because you want to be thinking about, when does FAPE eligibility end? And in terms of, when is the end of ARD committees and IEPs and special transportation and those kinds of things. Now, students who have modified content in the curriculum are going to be eligible for continued FAPE beyond meeting credit and assessment requirements. And all of this is in TAC, Texas Administrative Code 89.1070, 89.1070. And so those rules talk about participation in commencement ceremonies. So some students participate in graduation ceremonies, but they get a certificate and then they return to go to something like 18 plus in the continued eligibility. So you may have heard that students with disabilities are eligible for special ed services through 22. You want to be sure you're very clear about, for your child, when does FAPE eligibility end? So with that, we're going to move into 18 plus programs and services. What are those? And so those are really looking at shifting from the school day into adult life. So for students who are eligible for 18 plus services, you might be in a district where they have dedicated 18 plus programs to serve multiple students, because there are enough students that we can provide, we have a structured program to provide those 18 plus services. Or you might be in a district where we don't have an 18 plus program because there's only maybe a student here and there who is even eligible for continued services. So we provide services as appropriate for that student as needed. Regardless, so 18 plus services are about FAPE and 18 plus programs are about district decisions. Regardless, what we're looking at with those 18 plus services is shifting from the school day into the adult schedule and thinking about what does life look like when the bus stop's coming, and where will this student go during the day? Will they be working? Will they be accessing the community? Will they be going to the gym? Where will they be going during the day? And what supports will be needed? Will they have an attendant? Will they independently get themselves from place to place using the public bus, using Uber, using different transportation systems? I've heard things like using a Segway, using a golf cart, but we're going to be thinking about, how does a student get around and who supports and what supports do they need along the way. And we're looking at transferring those supports to the paid or natural supports that will be available in adulthood. So that might be family supports, agency supports, because the way I've heard it explained most clearly is, if it's going to fall apart, we want it to fall apart on our watch while you still have access to FAPE. So what we want to see is a fading. We want schools to be implementing the adult schedule and putting things in place, and then fading those supports so that families and students have time to practice that adult schedule before FAPE eligibility ends. So that's really essentially what 18 plus boils down to, is thinking about that. And so again, it's not eligible, not all students are eligible for 18 plus, but you would want to, if you think that that might be something that your child needs, you would want to be talking to your ARD committees and your school folks pretty soon to talk about, are we going to be eligible, and what does that look like here? Okay, last tip. The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today. So this is just another kind of an encouragement piece that, for some families that I talk to, some parents get really concerned because they feel like it's too late. And I've talked to families of 14-year-olds who feel like, oh, I'm already behind. I haven't done enough. And so I always encourage families to kind of pause and think, okay, you've probably done more than you think. Typically, if you're worried about it, that probably means that you've done more than you think. And also, start with gathering that information. Look at the Texas Transition and Employment Guide. Use those resources. Get some more information. Apply that to your own family, to your own child, to your own needs, and just start. Just start now. So that's the thing that I share with families. And so whether your child is 22 and this is their last few months of eligibility right now, or whether your child is in elementary and you're trying to get ready and put everything in place so that you're really ready for the transition to adulthood, wherever you are, just start with what you can start with right now. And what I also like to do is share this with educators to remind them, look at big picture, what are we doing for students from first eligibility? Structurally, how are we as a district helping families understand and be introduced to transition as appropriate to the age level? We don't necessarily need to be going over graduation requirements. In fact, we probably shouldn't be going over graduation requirements for our students with disabilities in early childhood. That's too much, and it's going to change a lot. So we don't need to bog parents down with that. But how are we connecting them with maybe the signing up for Medicaid waiver and signing up for those services that have a long waiting list in Texas? How are we helping them to understand what's out there and what we need to be doing now, that we might be starting small, but we're going to be thinking long term? And so how do we kind of help parents and support families in doing that? And so so this is kind of my language to families is, it's okay, you're starting where you're starting, and if you're participating in this webinar, you've started transition planning, so you're doing the work. And for educators, I just remind you to look, broad umbrella, what's different? How do we introduce transition planning, and what looks different at each grade band? So with that, if you, I know we covered a lot in a short amount of time, and so if you are wanting more information about transition planning, I've selected a few resources. There are some really great Texas resources, Texas specific, and what I selected here are really with a family audience. This is really designed for parents and people with disabilities in thinking about the transition to adulthood. So you see Navigate Life Texas, Texas Project First, Texas Parent to Parent, Pathways to Adulthood. I had talked about them with the networks, so that's a great resource for networks. Partners Resource Network and the Texas Sibling Network. Always when we're thinking about transition planning, be thinking long-term, and if your child has siblings, involve them in the transition planning discussions, or if not, what about cousins or same age family peers? Who else could be involved that is going to be supporting, if support will be needed, who will be available long-term? So those are some Texas resources. And then you see some national resources. Pacer Center, I had quoted their language on self-determination earlier. And the National Deaf Center has some wonderful resources. And then understood.com also has some great resources for a lot of needs and a lot of understanding how to navigate the special education services, but also they have some specific resources for transition planning. And so that's if you want more broad information about transition planning in general. And then if you are at a point where you want some help with transition planning in your child's IEP, the first place I would think you'd want to start is your child's teacher, or that might be called the case manager or the tracking teacher, but it would be the person who's kind of in charge of your child's folder. There's somebody on every campus who is in charge of that. Who is the teacher who is responsible for those ARD meetings? So you would want to maybe start there, or with the ARD committee member that you're comfortable with. Beyond that, you might want to check in with a campus administrator, maybe the assistant principal who oversees special education, or the principal. So you might want to think in terms of the campus administrators. We've talked about the TED, and you know how to find the TED for your district on the Legal Framework website. So you have the TED, not just anyone named TED, but the TED, the Transition and Employment Designee. And then you also have a resource with your special education administrators, so coordinator, director, those folks can be a good resource for specific questions about transition planning. And then you also have the people on My State Network. So at the beginning, we talked about the education service centers. So there is a specialist like me at every service center who's on the Secondary Transition Post-School Results Network, or the Transition Network. You could just kind of shorthand that, the Transition Network. And so you can contact your ESC if you want some support from outside of your school district. So there's lots of ways to get support that way. And so with that, I'm going to take a moment to open it up to questions. And Randy, I'll let you.
Okay. We have had one come early, but it wasn't specific to what you were talking about. So it's a great question, though. Let me move. I have two screens I'm working with over here. I submitted an application of the vocational rehabilitation service for my child in January 2019. But the Texas Workforce Solutions Service Coordinator keeps asking me if my son is in high school now or next school year. As my understanding, in Texas, the transition age is 14. When we apply for VR services for the child, should we go by the child's age or the grade, like high school, he is in? In my case, my child is 14, but currently is in 7th grade due to retention. My school did develop some transition IEP, but I don't think that the transition IEP is related to future employment at all. The transition IEP school developed seems more like an ELA goal. I was told that the transition goal has to align with the TEKS, T-E-K. Any suggestions?
Okay, that is a great question, and it's a big question. And I almost think that I heard two questions in there. That one question was about when and how to apply for vocational rehabilitation services. That might be part one of the question. And part two of the question was about transition planning in the IEP this year, if I understood that question correctly. So for the second part of the question, I will go back to this slide of, and maybe by the time we got to the slide, that's what you were already kind of jotting down. But in terms of transition planning in your child's IEP, and how that looks, and if you feel that it meets those requirements that we looked at earlier, and if it's helpful to you in planning, that I would think about these people and kind of in this order. You know, if you've already spoken with the campus people, that maybe you'd want to find the TED for your district, see if they can help with understanding transition planning in your district, and then kind of move beyond. And then and so if you're in a district that's in Region 13 in the Austin area, you can contact me, and I'll also tell you that you can contact me. And if you're not in a district in my region, I can connect you with the person who is. So the shorthand would be, you can contact me. The other piece of that would be that I can connect you with the resources and you know, some of the resources that I shared. And I kind of want to go back to the first part of the question in terms of the when and how to apply for vocational rehabilitation services. So that is a great question, and it is worth exploring that and what that looks like. I know that Voc Rehab, there's something called pre-ETS, pre-employment transition services, that is something that vocational rehabilitation provides for students who are eligible or potentially eligible for VR services in adulthood, and it's for 14 and up. And I am wondering if Randy's popping in to mention the webinar. Would you like to tell them about the upcoming webinar?
I believe it's March the 26th. It's at our website, but we will be hosting a pre-ETS, pre-employment transition service webinar by Vocational Rehab. They have some new programs this summer in addition to what they ran last year. So we will learn about those and how you can sign up for those programs. You don't have to be a VR client to access those programs. So if your child, like this person, was 14 and not in high school, and I don't know how that all works with the ARD part and the transition plan, but as far as these services, I think that as long as you're transition age, you can access these programs. So we'll find out more, though, later this month.
And I'm looking forward to that webinar as well. Yeah, so so that's something in terms of the decision making about who is eligible for pre-ETS services. That falls to the VR, Voc Rehab side, but it is something to be aware of. And my recommendation, kind of like you see on this slide, there's kind of this level of information in terms of if you don't get the information you need from you mentioned, I believe it was the TVRC, the Transition Vocational Rehabilitation Counselor, maybe for your campus, that if if you're confused by the information that they're sharing, or it doesn't match with what you're learning in things like the pre-ETS webinar, then you might want to go up a level and speak to the regional manager for VR and for transition VR services in that region. Or you might want to reach out to your ESC contact so that they can get you in contact with somebody else at VR so that you can feel confident that you're getting the information that you need. So it's kind of a similar way when I think about VR. And I'm fortunate to have contact with some really outstanding VR folks. We've got regional manager and state level coordinators who are really provide great information and help us problem solve when I get a call about a situation that doesn't quite make sense to me and I need help with that. We have some great people at VR. And so I just kind of recommend that you keep asking those questions until you get that information that you need. So I see another question might have come in. I'm going to try to open that up.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'm seeing that question here. Repose that question of over 18 and who can invite parents. Oh, okay. So this you'd like. It looks like you would like to have maybe pursue that question later. Is that what I'm seeing in that question?
Looks like it. Yes.
Okay. That's a good idea. Yeah, we can talk about that individually. And we have time for more questions. I just wanted to take a moment to leave my contact information up here, because that's another thing I was thinking is that for really individual questions, feel free to contact me. And like I said, even if you're not in the Austin area, I can help you get in contact with people in your region, either from VR or from the ESC world. So, so with that, I'll give it as much time for more, if we have more questions coming in.
Give it another minute or so and see if we have any other questions. There's nothing so far.
Okay.
We did get a comment, and I'll send this out to people, but the Dina Abramson, who is part of the Talking Book program with the Texas State Library Archives. I may not be saying that exactly right, but she has a copy of something she wants to share.
Excellent.
Transition Guide and Learning Differences Guide. So I'll get that from her and send that out as a additional resource in a follow-up email.
Okay.
Okay. I think that's it, Elizabeth. I don't see any other questions. Thank you all very much for attending and being a participant today. The information will be posted to our YouTube channel. I will email you the link in case you want to share that with others. But for today, I wish you a great afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.